Game jams are a bit of a rite of passage for game developers. You're typically given a theme, a tight deadline, and just enough time to panic as you try to figure out why your game keeps crashing. However, it's these constraints that make game jams interesting, as they push you to focus, experiment, and actually finish something. Hi, I'm Ross, and this is a devlog for Caddie Cards, a tiny golf game about playing the right shots from the hand you're dealt, that I made for my first game jam. Having never participated in a game jam before, the LOWREZJAM was the first game jam that I'd entered, giving its participants a generous 16 days to make and submit a game, with the only requirement being that your game has to be made in a 64 by 64 resolution or less. While that's a tiny resolution for a game jam it's kind of ideal, as the limited space naturally encourages smaller game ideas, which makes it far more likely that you'll finish before the deadline. With that in mind, it was time to start thinking about what kind of game I was going to make. I started by focusing on mechanics that I'd like to explore during the jam, while also considering mechanics that I thought I could implement quickly. I'd previously made a chess-like game, so I felt very comfortable with making grid-based games at this point, and with the seemingly never-ending hype around deck-building games at the moment, I'd also been toying with the idea of using cards in a strategic context, which was something I hadn't yet explored. Latching onto these points, I thought it would be interesting to explore the idea of a game that utilises grid-based movement, but where every move you make is dictated by a hand of playing cards. That ended up becoming the foundation for a tiny card-based, on-the-grid golf game. The game would be all about working with the cards that you're dealt to chain the right shots together in order to reach the flag in the fewest moves possible. Unlike a typical golf game, where the player has fine control over the angle and power of their shot, instead of timing a swing, you play cards to move, with each card representing a specific shot with a given direction and distance. It's golf, but through an interface that plays more like a tactics game. You draw a small hand from a deck of cards at the start of each hole, and from there, you'd have to make do. You might have a long shot forward, or a short hop to the left, or a medium-range diagonal shot. The challenge is in figuring out how to stitch those options into a clean path that will get you to the flag. Every shot is deterministic, so the only randomness comes down to what cards will end up in your hand next, which will force you to adapt depending on what cards you draw. It's more about problem solving than precision. So, with a game idea in mind, I hopped into Pico 8 to begin prototyping. If you're not familiar with Pico 8, it's a fantasy console that's used for both making and playing tiny games. Think of it like a virtual retro gaming system with strict limits: 128 by 128 pixels of screen space, 16 colours, and tiny cartridge sizes. I'd previously made 4 games in Pico 8, so for rapid prototyping, it's the game engine I'm most comfortable working with. It lends itself perfectly for the LOWREZJAM, as by running this little line of code at the beginning of a project, the game runs in a 64 by 64 resolution as opposed to its usual 128 by 128 resolution. With that in mind, I started by mocking up the map space using a grid of terrain chunks that can later be populated with fairway, sand bunkers, rough, and water. I assembled these chunks into a compact 3x4 layout that measured 12 tiles wide by 16 tiles tall. This would give me just enough room to create a course that was small enough to feel impactful without feeling overwhelming given the tiny screen resolution. Once I'd gotten the grid implemented, I moved on to coding the card mechanics, which involved populating the initial deck of cards, dealing cards into the player's hand, and then displaying the result of each card on the course when the player hovers over it. I then worked on player movement, sending the ball flying in the direction and distance shown on a card when the player selects it. It quickly became apparent that the game would benefit from a free cam mode. Since the 64 by 64 resolution gives you such little room to see ahead, I wanted to give players a way to pan around and assess the upcoming course before committing to a shot. This extra bit of visibility made it a lot easier to plan a route to the green, especially when hazards come into play in later courses. With a working camera implemented, I then got around to adding in collision logic between the golf ball and the course boundary, as previously there was nothing stopping you from ignoring the flag and just playing out into the void instead. And things get pretty weird out there. So, one painstaking amount of code later, the ball now smacks into the edge of the course, and the shot gets deflected back in field. I spent way too much time coding the logic for this. Specifically, collisions occurring in the corners of the map proved to be a lot more challenging to tackle than I had previously thought, as multiple collisions could occur as a result of a single shot. I think the end result of this multi-collision case is still a little bit janky, but I'd already wasted enough time on this one particular scenario by this point in the jam, and I don't think it's likely to be seen by most players anyway. So, with the core movement mechanics now up and running, it was time to throw a rough layout for the first hole together. As this would be the player's first experience with the game, I kept this first level pretty straightforward. However, if they're not careful, they could still end up landing in the rough or in a bunker. I added movement penalties to the player's next shot if this happens, with the player only being able to move a maximum of 2 spaces if they have to play out of the rough, or a maximum of 1 space if they find themselves playing out of a bunker, regardless of what card they choose to play next. It was at this point I jumped into some early playtesting, and right away I started to see what really wasn't working. The hardest part of the game design so far seemed to be designing the card system itself. I'd started with a deck populated with cards of all directions and various distances, but I quickly realised that having too much card variety often resulted in less than ideal gameplay. Since you always want to be moving forwards through the course towards the green, reaching a situation where you only had backward shots available was downright frustrating. To prevent this, I cut the deck down to just the essentials, a much tighter pool of cards, the majority of which move the players forward through the course, with a few cards that the player can use to reposition their ball to the left or right. This new deck still wasn't perfect, however, as I found that you could still end up in scenarios where, for example, the hole was to your right, but you would only have cards available that could move you directly forwards or to the left. That said, at least you're never forced to move backwards anymore. Overall, this new deck felt much more satisfying to play with. However, I now had a new hurdle I needed to overcome. Putting. Putting ended up being one of the trickier parts of the game's design. The main deck was all about large movements, chaining together cards to cross fairways, dodge bunkers, and close the distance to the hole. But once you were near the green, those cards became too blunt to be useful. You'd constantly overshoot the hole, or get stuck with cards that just weren't precise enough. I toyed with the idea of swapping to a more traditional putting system, using a power bar once you'd landed on the green, but quickly scrapped this idea as I wanted to stick to the card-based gameplay that I'd established so far. Instead, I ended up splitting putting into its own system by using a separate deck of cards that only appears once the ball lands on the green. This new deck contains shorter, more precise cards tailored specifically for tapping the ball gently into the hole, trading long-range planning for tighter, more deliberate shots. It also solved the frustration of overshooting the flag with a powerful drive right at the finish line. This change helped to give the gameplay a better sense of progression. You'd start each hole zoomed out, planning a route through hazards with a limited hand, but once you're on the green, the putting phase becomes a clean, satisfying finish. This shift from long game to short game gave each hole a clear arc, and helped to vary the game's pacing even within the tiny scope of the jam. With the core mechanics in place, it was time to bring everything together into an actual game. I designed 8 additional courses, each one trying to introduce a new twist, whether it be tighter spaces or trickier hazards and layouts. The goal was to keep things feeling fresh. In some later levels, I experimented with adding multiple routes, giving the option of taking a longer but safer path to the green, or a shorter but riskier one packed with hazards. Between each hole, I also added a simple scorecard screen as a quick way to track how many shots you've taken to complete the course. Then came the finishing touches. A title screen, background music and sound effects to give each shot a bit more personality. I also added a flyby at the beginning of each hole to give the player a little overview of the course before they played it. And lastly, an end screen that pops up when the player finishes the game. Individually, each of these additions didn't take all too long to implement, but they really helped to transform the project from feeling like a prototype into something that felt more like a complete game. So, that's Caddie Cards, a minimalist take on golf viewed through the lens of a tactics game. I had a blast making it, with the jam's constraints pushing me to keep things tight and simple. I would have loved to explore the possibility of adding deck building elements and procedurally generated levels to the game to give it more replayability. However, given the time constraint of the jam, I had to abandon those ideas in order to get the game finished in time. Still, those are directions I'd be excited to revisit in the future, whether it be through an expanded version of Caddie Cards or a new project inspired by it. As for how the game did, it ended up placing 6th in LOWREZJAM overall, which I was absolutely thrilled with for my first Game Jam entry. If you'd like to give it a try, it's free to play on itch.io. I'll put a link to it in the video description. And if you made it this far, please consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel for future updates. Thanks for watching.